Most important title is being a father and grandfather. And doing research is a byproduct of when I'm in good mood, I do puppet theater for my grandchildren. So that's. But today we'll deal with other puppets. Good morning, anyhow, and I'm sorry that something wasn't well arranged, and a laptop will arrive somewhere, sometime in the forthcoming minutes, and that will allow me to use the PowerPoint presentation more easily. But we can open with the introductory part. For which I don't need at the moment the presentation. And so we are convened here to hear about the ghettos and why did they emerge. Is that a question at all? Everybody knows, right? There are shelves full of books and studies on ghettos. And it was quite clear to everybody that we know why there were ghettos at all during the Nazi period. But this is the interesting thing about doing research is that from time to time, quite often, when we really delve into the particulars, we see that we don't really understand the whole picture and the origins of phenomena, and that we are stuck in some bug which we have to solve. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is not only to speak about and to show you how I understand today and how we understand the very fact of the emergence of ghettos at all and why during the Nazi period, but also the aspect of the history of research, of Holocaust research, which impacted on our misunderstanding in the past of this phenomenon. And by the way, this is a study I never thought that I would do, but is a sudden result of a project which we started at Yad Vashem. And that is, you probably have seen it, the Encyclopedia of the Ghettos. We initiated this project about a decade ago, and interestingly, without coordination also, the museum in Washington, Holocaust Museum in Washington, started a similar project within a larger program, larger project, and their volume was just published. That is this one. I schlepped it with me today. Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, 1933-1945. And as you will be able to see if you read the two books, there is a disagreement between the two approaches, and I'll try to explain it also afterwards. But anyhow, if we go back to the beginnings of this project, and also to the beginnings of the project of the museum in Washington, of course, when you have to plan plan a project, you have to know how many people should be involved, how much money to invest in it, how much time will it take, how big the result, the book will be. So there are several material questions that you have to meet in the beginning in order to understand. And that raised the question of how many ghettos were there at all. Nobody had even an estimation. about 10 years ago, even less. If we go into and read the historiography, we see that there are no numbers, no clear numbers. In several places we will find hundreds. On the website of the Washington Museum in 2007 were written about 700. Yad Vashem didn't mention on its website an exact number. If you read the 2008 book of Donald Bloxham, The Final Solution, A Genocide, he speaks of thousands. So how many ghettos were there? We didn't know. And that's a problem. Moreover, in order to be able then for us to define a ghetto, in order to include it in the list, we needed a definition, right? We discovered actually something which we actually knew before, that there was never a definition, a German definition. There was never a clear German order to establish ghettos. That's a problem. Now, in several books, for instance, in Judah Bauer's book, History of the Holocaust, you'll find that in the document, which I hope all of you know, Reinhard Heydrich's Schnellbrief of the 21st of September 1939, the term ghetto is mentioned, and there is a footnote. This is the order to establish ghettos. We'll see it later on because we have to carefully read this document in order to see that there was no order to establish ghettos. If we look into Christopher Browning's book on the origins of the final solution, he also, in several ways, relates to it, to the Schnellbrief, and I'll come back to his view, and others are doing the same. So there is some agreement among scholars that in the Schnellbrief, in Heydrich's urgent letter, if we translate it exactly from the German, in this urgent letter of 21st of September 1939, there is an order to establish ghettos. Moreover, if we read encyclopedias and comprehensive studies of the Holocaust, we say that from the moment the Germans entered Poland, they started to establish ghettos. And you'll find something like this also in our museum, which was conceived in the 1990s. Right? But there is no clear order. There is no clear order, there's no definition. So we had to define it, which is very weird that the scholars have to define a phenomenon post factum, not relying on the actor's own definitions. So here we see already a basic problem. So we made a kind of decision that ghettos, we define ghettos as places where the term was used, but also with equivalent names like Jewish Quarter and so on, for places, for Jewish neighborhoods where Jews were confined to for at least a month in cities, in the cities where they lived before. But that was our decision. Now the decision made and the definition made by the team in Washington was less than a month. Could be a week or 2 weeks. If the term ghetto, even in testimonies, was used, so you'll find more places in their volume than in ours. Right? Also for places that, according to my understanding, were not ghettos at all, and sometimes it's also that the post-1945 view and vocabulary and discourse on the Holocaust, where the term ghetto became commonplace, that people say, well, we lived in a kind of ghetto. If this appears in a testimony, they decided to include it in their volume, and therefore you'll find differences, and quite considerable differences, between their volume and ours, and many more places included in their volume. But going back to the historiography and to the 1940s and 1950s, right, the question is, why do we have a certain view of the emergence of the ghettos? And this has to do, I would say, with two things, with two origins. The first one is the fact that the first perceptions of the Holocaust as an overall phenomenon were shaped by Jewish historians, mostly coming from Poland. Some of them with the background of Warsaw. And therefore, the Polish view, the Polish-centered view of, and the Warsaw-centered view of the ghettos became so important. Now, I think all of you have read the Yad Vashem Encyclopedia of the Holocaust and several other encyclopedias of the Holocaust. When we look at the entries there and in educational material, then we'll get an overall explanation of the ghetto phenomenon and then examples. Now, we look well at the examples given all the time for everything, be it the Jewish Council, be it the underground activities, be it social mutual aid, and so on and so forth. We'll see example, Warsaw, Lodz, Lodz, Warsaw, Warsaw, Lodz, Białystok, Warsaw, Lodz, Lodz, Warsaw, Krakow, and so on, perhaps Vilna, Lodz, Warsaw. So we get about 20 examples, 20 places where the examples are taken from all the time, for everything. And among these 20 examples, Warsaw and Lodz are about 70 to 80%. Right? When we finished the encyclopedia, we had more than 1,100 ghettos. And for the Washington volume, there are even more. So here a question arises, and that is, can we really understand the phenomenon in general on the basis of a very limited number of ghettos? Right? Indeed, large ghettos with a considerable number of survivors who testified about it, and with a considerable amount of documentation, which allows us to deal with these ghettos. Right? But is that enough in order to understand the phenomena? Moreover, another interesting result or discovery was that actually all scholars agree that the first ghetto in Poland was established in Piotrków Trybunalski in October 1939. Until 2009, there was no study on the ghetto of Piotrków Trybunalski. So on the first ghetto, there was no study. Right? That is, scholars looked for the place where it is easier to deal with than for the place where it started. Right? So we have another problem. And by the way, I said the first study on the ghetto of Piotrków-Trybunalski was written but was never published within the context of another enterprise, I would call it, and that is the Ghetto-Rentengesetz, the law to compensate forced or laborers in the ghettos, which was enacted by Germany in about a decade ago. And after several years, it turned out that 96% of the applications of Jews who had worked in ghettos, the applications were turned down, and there was a whole fuss in Germany, and they appointed a judge to deal with the issue, and they recruited a group of scholars from German universities, and they wrote studies for the courts on these ghettos, but it wasn't published. They are in the files of the German courts. So here we have one aspect, and that is the impact of Polish Jewish scholars on research. The second one, and that is even more important, I would say, is Raoul Hilberg's study, The Destruction of the European Jews, which you all know. It's very important to state that Hilberg, although a fine scholar, a great scholar, indeed, was not an historian. Now, some of my best friends are not historians, but he was a political scientist. And we have to understand the approach of the social sciences, of political scientists. Okay. No laptops at Yad Vashem, so I'll have to give some signs to the person over there afterwards. But okay, I hope it'll work. Anyhow, Raoul Hilberg was a political scientist. And he, as you all know, started his study in the beginning of the 1950s and wanted to understand the Holocaust as an overall event, as a bureaucratic event. And he shaped a model, which is a social scientific model, right? Not an historical development, but a model with certain escalating stages. The first one, and you know it all, is definition. Second one is expropriation. The third one is concentration, and the three of them together are the ingredients or the parts of the first overall stage of anti-Jewish policies, which allowed for immigration. And then the fourth stage in his model, which is also the second part of anti-Jewish policies, is annihilation. Right? Now, in Hilberg's view, concentration is identified with ghettoization. And that's very important to understand. Because what I will show you at the end, that ghettoization and concentration are different developments. And it has to be very clear. But in his view, and this is transmitted over and over in Holocaust historiography, that concentration and ghettoization are actually the same act. And maybe if you, over there, and what Hilberg says, if you can read it from here, the preliminary steps of the ghettoization process, and everywhere where you see the term ghettoization, you can read concentration, right? Consisted of marking, movement restrictions, and the creation of Jewish control organs. The three preliminary steps, marking, movement restrictions, and the establishment of a Jewish control machinery, were taken in the very first month of civil rule in Poland. In this book, we shall be interested in the ghetto only as a control mechanism for movement restrictions in the hands of the German bureaucracy. To the Jews, the ghetto was a way of life. To the Germans, it was an administrative measure. Now, as you will see, and that is something which is deeply ingrained in our perception of the Holocaust also, that there is an idea of establishing ghettos, of ghettoization, right? And the Jewish councils, the Judenräte, are part of the ghettoization process. That's what you know, right? Right? That's what everybody teaches, right? But if we look into the Schnellbrief of the 21st of September 1939, we'll see there's a whole chapter about the Jewish councils. There's nothing about the ghettos. The term ghetto is used somewhere, but there's no chapter about the ghettos. Right? So Hilberg, with his view as a political scientist, turned it upside down, said there is a ghettoization, right? And the Jewish councils are part of the ghettoization process. I'm telling you already now that these are two different developments. They overlap at many places, but there are different developments. And that's very important to understand. So he imposed a certain developmental pattern on the historical material. Now, if we look at two recent publications, one is by a German scholar in a book from 2004, Michael Alberti, about the Warteland, the Wartegau, and he says at a certain moment, ghettoization, the establishment of the ghettos provided one of the most effective means to subordinate the Jewish population to a total control and exploitation. With the beginning of the mass murder, they turned into giant prisons from where the Nazis could deport their inmates to the extermination camps. The ghettos were a milestone on the way to genocide. And that's what we have in mind, right? That there is a certain line of development, and the ghettos are part of this development towards the final solution. Intended or unintended depends on whom we read, right? But this is a step towards the final solution. An Israeli scholar, Baz Norman, in his book about the Nazi Weltanschauung, space body language, he says, the removal of the Jew from the urban space was part of a larger process of removal from the German political sphere and living space. The final aim was to turn them into Judenrein, while the space of the new city was reserved for the Aryan German. The ghetto was the urban space allotted to the Jew. So the ghetto becomes a term which is used for many places where we actually know that there were no ghettos, right? But if Jews were concentrated somewhere, he, as a scholar, calls it a ghetto. So now we go into the problem of the terminology. There is what the Germans call the ghetto, there is what the Jews call the ghetto, there is what the scholars call the ghetto. And it's not the same. When I worked on this several years ago, I corresponded with an American scholar who worked on the Ukraine, and she wrote about the ghettos, and I asked her, did they use the term ghetto? Because her book was full with the term ghetto. She said, no, in the documentation there was no ghetto. I used the term, right? So we have several layers which we have to go through. There's the German language, there is the Jewish language or the Jewish way of using the term ghetto at the time, and there is the post-war use of scholars who imposed the term on the reality of the period. So here we have a lot of problems. Maybe can move to the next. Yeah. It will come afterwards. It's or perhaps let's read it now. Here we have Christopher Browning in a very important article from the 1980s, mid-1980s, and he later on, of course, included his understanding also in his important book on the emergence of the final solution, and said ghettoization, and he is a little bit different than the others, was not a conscious preparatory step planned by the central authorities to facilitate the mass murder, nor did it have the set task of decimating the Jewish population. Ghettoization was in fact carried out at different times, in different ways, for different reasons, on initiative of local authorities. That's what he found, and Browning is a great scholar because he worked on the particulars of the scene in Poland. The concentration of Jews in Polish cities as a preliminary to their expulsion was part of a policy ordered by the central authorities in September 1939, and he is alluding to the Schnellbrief of September 21st, but the subsequent creation of sealed ghettos was not. On the contrary, the sealed ghetto resulted from the failure of Berlin's expulsion policy in Poland during the first month after the invasion of Poland. Local authorities were left to improvise and found their way to the sealed ghetto. They did so at different times and for different immediate reasons, but always within the common ideological parameters set by the failed expulsion policy, namely that ultimately Jews and Aryans did not live together. So we have a view, and this is also in the Yad Vashem Museum, that the Nazis entered Poland and started to establish ghettos, right? But if we look very clearly at the dates of the establishment of ghettos, then during 1939, the end of 1939, and through 1940, in the beginning of 1941, during a period of almost a year and a half, only about 40 ghettos were established. Most of them in the second half of 1940, in the beginning of 1941. And if there were close to 1,140 ghettos according to our findings, about 1,100 were established much later. So the majority of the ghettos was established much later, not after the invasion. So was it something which was really planned and developing and encompassing the whole picture? We know, in spite of the fact that there were a lot of ghettos, as we know at the end, we know there were a lot of places where there were no ghettos, right? At all, even in Poland. So was it a systematic policy? That's a problem. To this we have to add, and perhaps first of all to say about Browning, who is a great scholar and a great friend, but he was asked to write, by Yad Vashem, to write the volume which hopefully you all know about the emergence of the final solution, but the part he got is from the 1st of September 1939. So he didn't really deal with the period preceding the 1st of September 1939 conceptually. But there is a question, of course, if it starts afterward, what happened before? What led to it? What were the reasons to ghettoize Jews? Hilbert didn't ask it, this question. No others. It was quite clear that the Germans wanted to establish ghettos. But is that really so? If we look about on the dissemination of ghettos, we know that ghettos existed only where? In Eastern Europe. Deportations the latest phase, and before that, anti-Jewish policies in general were conducted everywhere. Ghettos were only in Eastern Europe, and not everywhere. As we know, in many places it happened only in 1941, 1942. 500 ghettos about were established in the occupied Soviet Union. So is it really part of a conceived program, a plan of anti-Jewish policies? Coming back to Hilberg, Hilberg was a political scientist. Hilberg wanted to see a pattern, right, using a scheme, and imposed it on the history, on the dynamic history. Which leads us to perhaps the most important thing, and that is, why use the term ghetto? Why? It could have been X, Y, Z, abracadabra, I don't know what, right? Why did they use the term ghetto? Hilberg was a political scientist. He was interested in administrative aspects. Most of the German scholars working on the Holocaust, on Nazism in general, are, I would say, documentary scholars. That is, the documents become a kind of a fetish, right? And are very focused on administrative issues, right? Who wrote to whom? Who carried it out? The bureaucracy is very, very important in German historiography of the Nazi period. It's one of the results of the enormous amount of documentation that we have, right? It is hundreds of kilometers of documents that we have to go through to read. It's impossible. We work together, somehow we relate to it, but the document becomes a kind of a fetish, and it's very important. I would like to suggest another approach, and that is the cultural one, the linguistic one, because there is one very important question. Why use the term ghetto? Ghetto is not a German invention of the period, a Nazi invention. The term ghetto existed long before, has its origins, has its history. Right? And this fact of going through the path of understanding the concept of the term and how it is used is very important. So, when was the term ghetto used for the first time? In Italy? When? No, 1516, yes. And that's the origin, because it comes from gettare, it's pouring metal, right? The ghetto was an island in Venice, right? And what happened is that in the beginning of the 16th century, Venice was surrounded by, was attacked and surrounded by a whole coalition of military forces, and the Jews who were not allowed to live in the city fled into the city, into the island, which was allotted to them, and that was the Ghetto Nuovo, that is the new ghetto, because there was an old ghetto, but that was the place where to dispose of metal And and the Jews, when they fled into the city and when then were accepted, were confined to that island, the Ghetto Nuovo, right? And that's the origin of the term. Right? It was actually done, this establishment of the first ghetto in the Middle Ages was done in favor of the Jews, to help them, because the city was surrounded. And afterwards, after the end of the siege, the Jews were allowed to stay in the city, right, in that place, which was surrounded with walls and two openings. And that's the way the term emerged for a Jewish community in the beginning. And because of the importance of Venice in the beginning of the 16th century in its international trade, the term was transferred afterwards to one of the places where Venice had connections with, Dubrovnik, or Ragusa originally, and where's the fell asleep there? The person next to me. Okay. Here you have the ghetto of Ragusa from 1546. There were two lines of apartments which were allotted to the Jews in the city, and that's the ghetto of Ragusa, 1546. And afterwards, in 1555, the Pope, who started actually as the Counter-Reformation, already started with anti-Jewish policies and gave an order to confine Jews everywhere to a certain part in the city, and from there on, it spreads in Italy in the 16th and 17th and 18th century to several cities in Italy, right? And the last ghetto in Italy was established in the 1770s. Now, the interesting thing is what happens afterwards in the 19th century. Right? With the dissolution of the ghettos, with the advance in emancipation process, right? Jewish neighborhoods, and by the way, the term also moved to other places which were not called ghettos in the beginning. For instance, in Frankfurt, the Judenviertel, the Jewish neighborhood, was commonly also called the ghetto, so the term spread all over. But in the 19th century, these Jewish neighborhoods were dissolved. Yet the term ghetto became used more and more in discourse, in Jewish discourse and in non-Jewish discourse. In very interesting ways. In Jewish discourse, we find two paths, the positive one and the negative one. In negative one, for instance, in Zionist writings towards the end of the 19th century, Herzl used the term in as a negative, as a term for a negative situation of the Jews, that they are confined to their places. In different writings, we find it also as a situation from which the Jews have to get out of the ghetto. If you know the title of Jacob Katz's book about the emancipation, that Jews have to get out of the ghettos in order to integrate into general society. So for emancipationists and for Zionists towards the end of the 19th century, this term was tainted. On the other hand, we can find in other writings, and of course it was also used by anti-Semites. On the other hand, what we can find is and that's towards the end of the 19th century too, that when the process of assimilation proceeded, that we find the term used in a positive way, that in the ghetto there was still some real Jewish life. Right? And if you are interested in reading a fine book just in the evening, if you don't fall asleep, take Israel Zangwill's writings, and he wrote about the ghetto in very fond terms, the ghetto of London. Right? But it was a term used for the Jewish neighborhood. So the terms is used more and more for a poor Jewish neighborhood where the Jews clung together, lived together, and the more emancipated Jews and the richer Jews leave the area of the ghetto. So we get a positive meaning and a negative meaning of the term ghetto towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. If we can move to the next slide. Here you have the positive approach of a book, Songs of the Ghetto, in German. It's the German translation. Morris Rosenfeld, a book published in the beginning of the 1920s in Germany. It's a German translation. And with pictures by Lillian. I don't know if you know this artist. He's quite well known. But the interesting thing is, if you'll see, the edition of 26 to 30,000 of this book, right? So it was a real bestseller. The term ghetto is much used. And here in a positive way, because people already in the period of advanced emancipation, those who regretted the fading away of Jewish life, spoke with nostalgia about the times of the ghetto. Right? So we can see that there is a history to the term ghetto, which started in the 16th century. Right? Ghetto has positive, but mainly negative, a negative meaning. And by the way, especially in Zionist discourse, it has a negative meaning. But altogether, it shows us that the term is much used before the Nazi period. So here we come to the 1930s, to the Nazi period. Maybe we can also use to the next picture. So the question is, when is and how is the term ghetto used during the 1930s? And we find it both in Jewish discourse, but later on also in non-Jewish discourse. And that's very interesting. So there is an interaction between the discourse of German Jews in the 1930s and the anti-Jewish policymakers in Nazi Germany. There is a very interesting source which was published in 2004 and recently translated into English, and that by professors Eberhard Jeckel from Germany and Otto Dov Kulka from Israel, and that is the secret reports of the security service and the security police of Nazi Germany, the SD and the Gestapo. And we have it also, there is a CD in it where you can read all the report or the part on the Jews in the secret reports of the security service and of the SS and the Gestapo. These were monthly reports from all over Germany, beginning at the end of 1933, and they monitor what was happening in German society. Right? So there are the Jewish parts. There are also sometimes proposals what to do with the Jews and so on. And there is a CD with a search engine, so you can check it easily. So how many times was the term ghetto used in these secret situation reports of the SS in the 1930s? Right? How would you imagine? How can you suggest a number? Well, 7 times. Always reflecting what the Jews are saying. So the term ghetto was used in the beginning of the Nazi period by the Jews. Why? Jews are saying, when anti-Jewish policies develop after 1933, Jews are saying they are confining us again to the ghetto, as it was in the Middle Ages. And here is an example by Rabbi Joachim Prinz. I hope you know his name. He was an important leader in German Jewry of Reform Judaism, afterward moved at the end of the 1930s to Canada, and he died, I think, 3 years ago. He lived in Toronto for many years, was rabbi of the Reform Temple there. And in an important article which he wrote on the eve of Pesach in 1935, he wrote that we live in a ghetto that starts to penetrate our consciousness now. We call ghetto that what we experience in the situation that we Jews of Germany live in a country where at many instances it is made clear that we are a burden on the German people. The medieval ghetto was being closed in the evening. One left the world and went into the ghetto. Today it's the opposite. When the door of our house closes behind us, we leave the ghetto, which is outside, and enter our home. The ghetto isn't a geographically defined area anymore. The ghetto, that is the world. Outside is the ghetto for us. The ghetto is everywhere. That's the way he uses the term ghetto. All right? And there are other Jewish sources from at the end of 1933 onwards where the term ghetto is used by the Jews, interpreting what is happening to them. And they say they are confining us again to ghettos, like in the Middle Ages. Right? So it's a Jewish interpretation. Now, can I have the next slide? So we can see that this is, as you see, it's a cultural and linguistic approach to the term ghetto, which will lead us on afterwards to understanding what happened. So we know about the source of the term. We know about the ghetto and ghettoization as cultural concepts in the modern age. We know now something about the beginning of the use of this term. And then we get to 1938, to the well-known meeting at Göring's office after Kristallnacht, after Reichskristallnacht, which will lead us back afterwards in time to the preceding months of 1938. But in 1938, as we know, Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, was an important event. And here we can see what Heydrich said in the meeting 2 days after Kristallnacht. And he says, now I will come to the issue of ghettos. As you can see, the term is used by him. It's not 1939. It's not after the invasion of Poland. It's 1930. It's here at the end of 1938. And what he says here the Ghetto, das Ghetto in der Form vollkommen abgesonderter Stadtteile, the Ghetto in the form of entirely segregated neighborhoods where there are only Jews, I see it from a police point of view as impossible to apply. Right? Or let's say from a police point of view, I think that a ghetto in form of a completely segregated district with only Jews is not possible. We would have no control over a ghetto where the Jews get together with the whole of his Jewish tribe. It would be a permanent hideout for criminals and, first of all, a source of epidemics and the like. The control of the Jews by the watchful eyes of the whole population is better than putting thousands upon thousands of Jews together in a single district of a city where uniformed officials will be unable to check on their daily activities. It's very interesting, right? We are at the end of 1938, and Heydrich is against ghettos. Because, why? Because in his view, and that is the cultural understanding of the term ghetto, is that ghettos are a concentration of Jews where you cannot control them, and it's a source for diseases and crime. So he is against ghettos. But interestingly, there is a letter by Heydrich from February 1937, where he proposes not to allow to enact a bill not allowing Jews to enter vacation sites and bath summer bathing places and so on. And there he says in February 1937 that this will help, if we enact such a bill, it will help us in ghettoizing the Jews. Right? So in February 1937, he is in favor of ghettoizing Jews in the meaning of not allowing Jews to enter German places, certain German places, certain vacation places. Right? Now, after Kristallnacht, he is fervently against ghettoization, right? And in September 1939, we see the emergence, or in the end of 1939, we see the emergence of ghettos. So what's going on here? In favor, against, or what? Now, the issue is that something happened in 1938. In the beginning, in 1937 and before, we can see that the term ghetto is understood in a more idiomatic way as a concentration of Jews with no special Nazi meaning. Right? A concentration which is either a place where you can confine Jews to, or which can be dangerous. But this is the concept which had emerged since the 16th century. Right? There was no clear Nazi meaning to this term. But something changed in 1938. Can you please? What changed in 1938 is, I would say, an amazing thing, and that is the impact of scholars on policymakers. That doesn't happen often, right? That scholar, well, they are us, but usually policymakers do something else. But in the middle of the 1930s, the field of Judenforschung, research on the Jews, started to develop in Nazi academia. And perhaps the leading person in this field was a professor, Peter Heinz Serafin, here's his name, and he wrote a book He became later on the professor in Königsberg, but he was before that in other places. And in September or October 1938, he published this book, Jewry in the Eastern European Space. This is an amazing book. And you see here a slide of the copy which my late father bought in the 1980s in an antiquariat in Amsterdam. Perhaps some of you know that my late father, was once director of Yad Vashem in the 1950s. He was also a Holocaust scholar, although concentrating on the Netherlands. But he bought a lot of books, which I have now, and relating to the to the Holocaust. And in the 1980s, he bought this book, which you can find also in other libraries, but in an antiquariat in Amsterdam. Now, sometimes you have to know which copy of an edition you have to buy, because this copy, as you can see, perhaps those who have fine glasses will be able to read up there that this was the copy which was kept at the Amt des Generalgouverneurs für die besetzte polnische Gebiete. This is the copy from the library of Hans Frank in Poland, right? And from the very beginning, because the Generalgouvernement or Generalgouverneur, that's the title which Hans Frank kept, which he got at the end of October 1939, but only during the first weeks it was called Generalgouverneur für die besetzte polnische Gebiete. This second line was dropped after several weeks. He was only general governor, right? So this, and we can see also this was book number 371 in the library of the basic books which the Germans took with them to Poland. Right? So it's not just a copy, it's the copy itself. This copy itself, this volume is a document by itself, and that's very important. Now, this was published in September 1938. There is a German scholar who wrote his PhD about seraphim. It's interesting by the name. It's a Hebrew term, but it was, seraphim and kruvim were used in Christian theology over the decades. So it's definitely not a Jewish name. But this book was published in September, the end of September 1938, and it was read by the people of the Gestapo and the security service of the SS. And this had an enormous impact. And this book made Heydrich change through the officials who worked for him, right? Change his view of the ghettos. In February 1937, he was in favor, and I didn't mention before that in his letter he wrote, it will help us ghettoize the Jews, that if we won't allow them to enter these places which will be open to the German people only, it will help us to ghettoize Jews, that is, to get them out from German places. Now, at the end of 1938, he's not in favor of ghettoizing Jews, but he's against ghettoizing Jews. And this book made the difference. And please, let's go. This book, which is very important, it has close to 800 pages, and people at the YIVO in New York told me, already in the 1980s, that they used the book very much because there's important material in it, but they never disclosed that they used this book, right? That they quoted. But he was an expert on Jewish issues in Eastern Europe, and he collected a lot of material, and if you look into the bibliography of the book, he read Rupin and Tartakover and Ringelblum and Schipper. He read all these Jewish historians, and he assembled the data. And one of the chapters dealt with the urbanization of the Jews, and there are 15 pages about ghettos in it. Now, and there are a lot of diagrams. Here you have the most important Jewish cities in Poland in 1931. Next one. The biggest Jewish cities in Eastern Europe. Go on. And September 1938, the Warsaw Ghetto. September 1938, not 1940. Here, see, das jüdische Ghetto in Warschau. Go on. The Krakow Ghetto. Go on. Dissemination of the Jews in Lemberg, Lvov. Go on. The Jewish Ghetto in Wilna. The creation of the ghetto in Lodz. Go on. The concentration of Jews in Kovno. Yes. Dissemination of the Jews in Riga. Okay. So we can see there were ghettos. They were not invented by the Nazis. Ghettos were Jewish neighborhoods, dense concentration of Jews in Eastern Europe. He was an expert, Serafim was an expert on the Jews in Eastern Europe. And he said there are ghettos. And as I showed you before, this is a term which was used by Jews and others for concentrations of Jews, of Jewish neighborhoods in cities, especially in Eastern Europe. It is, by the way, intensely used by Jews in the discourse in the Jewish newspapers in Poland between the two world wars, constantly. So the term was used all the time. And the Jews and these ghettos are in the cities, and as we can see often in these maps which I showed just now, is that they are in the center of the cities. And it's very important to think about it, right? About the ghetto phenomenon, because it is usually interpreted in the wake of Hilberts and others that ghettoization is a process of segregating the Jews in order for the Jews not to interfere in general life. Right? But if we look at the places where the ghettos were situated in the cities, were in the centers of the cities. The correspondence on the establishment of a ghetto or closing of the ghetto in Warsaw in 1940, going on for months, is that it will cause an enormous problem in the neighborhoods in the centers of these cities. What Serafim writes in a special paragraph in these 15 pages on ghettos in Eastern Europe is that the ghetto is at the same time also the basis from which the Jewish expansion originates. From here do the population surplus and the social misery drive the Jews into the non-Jewish branches of the economic and cultural life of the host countries. In the ghetto, the threads of not only the Jewish economic life, but also of the entire urban infrastructure are interwoven. Here do the merchants settle, starting with the peddlers and the rag dealers and ending up with the middle class, big and export merchants. From here does the proletarized Jewish artisan make his way to the factory. Here are the religious and political Jewish leaders fostered. Here is the Jewish essence in its specific form as it is found in Eastern Europe, shaped in order to exert from here, from the business center, influence on the surroundings and on the nations among whom the Jews live. So in his interpretation, he used a lot of Jewish sources. He read Jewish scholars. But he interpreted it in a Nazi way, in an anti-Semitic way. And while the Jews were complaining about the bad situations in the Jewish neighborhoods in Poland between the two world wars, about the poverty and so on, he was claiming now, in reinterpreting, as the ghettos being the sources, the Jewish neighborhoods in Eastern Europe being the sources of the Jewish power. Right? So we can see that in the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, and the way it was used in Germany in the 1930s, the term ghetto was an idiom, but not relating to a real situation. We are ghettoized, that is, we are in Plaut's reading, for instance, we are excluded from the general society. But in Eastern Europe, the term ghetto was something real. Right? So when Serafim in 1938 diverted or changed the view from looking at German Jewish society to Eastern European society, he said, well, the ghetto is dangerous. We don't have to ghettoize Jews. We have to be very wary about those Jewish concentrations. Right? And because there, the Jewish essence is shaped. So we have to avoid, if we now look back at this, at Heydrich's words on the 12th of November 1938, he is fervently against ghettos, because that's a concentration of Jews which is dangerous. We have to avoid it by all means. Right? What changes now in September 1938, in 39, with the invasion of Poland, that there is no such an option. Ghettos are there. Jewish neighborhoods are there. So what to do with them? Please. And this is from a booklet of the Ministry of Propaganda on the eve of the invasion of Poland. But that's about the Jews, and here's the Jewish world. Here they show you the ghetto. This is August 1939, before the invasion of Poland, please. All right? Jewish streets, they call it, in Osteuropäischen Städten, in Eastern European cities, please. And here, the face of the Eastern European Jews, and here you can see the ghetto as a source of danger is part of the understanding of the Ostjuden, of the Eastern European Jews, which leads us already to understanding why there were no ghettos in Central, Southern, and Eastern and Western Europe, only in Eastern Europe. Has to do with the phenomenon of the Ostjuden, of the Eastern European Jew, yes? Here it's mentioned the ghetto of Paris, that is the Eastern European Jews who went to the Pletzel in Paris, for those of you who know the place. Go on. And now we come to the Schnellbrief, the urgent letter, which I hope all of you know. But now we can reread it without, or with putting Hilberg away, putting Bauer's interpretation, my good friend Bauer, but putting it away, right? And see what, in the paragraph 5, about the Jewish councils. Okay? Says, the council of elders in the concentration centers are to be made responsible for the appropriate housing of the Jews arriving from the countryside. For reasons of general police security, the concentration of the Jews in the cities will probably call for regulations in these cities, which will forbid their entry to certain quarters completely and that, but with due regard for economic requirements. They may, for instance, not leave the ghetto. It's not establishing a ghetto, and here in Bauer's book he has a footnote, this is the order to establish ghetto. No, right? And this is in the paragraph on the Jewish councils, right? So the ghetto exists. If you read it well, and you're not blinded by Hilberg or others, you will see they will not be allowed to leave the ghetto, which is the Jewish neighborhood, the Jewish quarter, right? Nor leave their homes after a certain hour in the evening. Right? May, for instance, it's a proposal, it's not an order. So what happened? What happened is that Heydrich was very much against ghettos in Germany after Kristallnacht. He said, we don't want them here. But the moment the Germans entered Poland, they encountered ghettos. They were there. There is no order to establish ghettos. There are ghettos, but there are also Jews who live outside the ghettos. And the ghettos are dangerous. Seraphim had written, and by the way, Seraphim becomes also an advisor to Hans Frank in Poland. But Seraphim had written that Jews in Eastern Europe swarm out from the ghettos. So when they now encounter, when they enter Poland and encounter the Jewish communities all over, right? And there are a lot of descriptions by soldiers and commanders about these filthy Jews, and we drive through the ghetto and we see this phenomenon. Right? They are basing themselves on the propaganda that they had read, but they had not encountered Eastern European Jews in this way in Germany. Now they entered Poland and they said, well, the propaganda was right. Here they are, these Jews which we saw in the propaganda, right? And there are a lot of descriptions, and there is a very interesting book, important book, a PhD thesis by a German scholar, Jochen Böhler, where he quotes tens of expressions in personal letters of German soldiers during the first weeks of the invasion of Poland, how they despise these pictures of the Jews in their neighborhoods, especially in the poor neighborhoods in the cities when they enter these cities. Right? So the ghetto starts as a reaction to the encounter with the Eastern European Jews in Poland. Right? And when we look into the documentation of the first weeks in Poland, we see that they use the term zusammenfassen, that is, to contain, right? So we have to draw the Jews back into their neighborhoods, right? And the neighborhoods where they lived, that might be in the center of the city. Right? For instance, later on in Warsaw, that's such a problem. If you know also these pictures about the tramway and the way it go through, it disrupted urban life. And that's what the people of the Warsaw municipality are relating to during the discussions in 1940, that the establishment of a confined Jewish ghetto in the middle of Warsaw will cause a lot of problems to the daily life of Warsaw as a city, and the same is in other places. So the ghettos emerge from below, not as an order from above, as a reaction to the encounter with the Eastern European Jew. And therefore we have so many different ghettos. We have open ghettos, we have later on closed ghettos, and I'll come to it in a moment. But the beginning in Piotrków Trybunalski, the first place where it starts, right, that is in October 1938, there is an order given at the beginning of the month, and it's for those of you who have read Rabbi Lau's book, or his brother's book, even Naftali Lavi, is even for our issue more important. They were the two sons of the rabbi of Piotrków Trybunalski. Yeah? That's the first place where a ghetto was established. There is an order at the beginning of the month that Jews should concentrate in the Jewish neighborhood, right? And it is in a way, and it is imposed finally at the end of October 1938. But till the very end, in 1942, with the deportation of the Jews, there were some non-Jews living in the ghetto, and several Jews lived outside the ghetto. And it was not a closed ghetto. And you'll find it in the historiography, open ghettos, closed ghettos. Why? It was not a decision or an overall decision. It was made by the local commanders. And what we see afterwards is that the ghetto phenomenon gradually develops. So it starts in Piotrków Tribunalski, and afterwards is taken over by other local commanders as a reaction to the encounter with the Eastern European, the Polish Jew. That's it. The ghettos emerge as a reaction to the Eastern European Jew, to the image of the Eastern European Jew, to the fear, because of the fear for the Eastern European Jew. And therefore, it is not a hermetically closed system. There are many places all over Poland where there are no ghettos until the very end, especially in the little places. But in the middle size and the big cities, where there are huge Jewish populations, there the Jews are conceived as a danger, so they have to be contained and confined to a neighborhood where they used to live before. Rationally, we would have said, if we confine the Jews, it should be at the outskirts of the city, outside. But these ghettos are in the Jewish neighborhoods, in the poor Jewish neighborhoods, right? And they're stuck in the throats of those cities, right, in the middle, and therefore they cause such a lot of problems to urban life, to daily urban life in these cities. We cannot understand it in other way. So it is a phenomenon which develops gradually. It starts as a reaction to the encounter with the Eastern European Jew, right? And it is taken over to several little places in the Warthegau at the beginning of 1942. And as we know, on the 10th of December 1939, Ubeler in Lodz gives an order about it says it is impossible to include all the Jews in a certain place in the ghetto, but we'll do it in one part of the city, and it still takes 4 months to establish this ghetto. But the ghetto of Lodz, and maybe, hello, he's talking with somebody else there. This is the Lodz ghetto, the Litzmannstadt ghetto, that's the map, right? But it is closed in April 1940, right? It's, by the way, month after the majority of the Jewish councils were established. So the Jewish council is a different phenomenon. I'm writing a book about that, and I've written several articles. That's an idea which developed already systematically in the middle of the 1930s. But it's different. The ghetto is a reaction to the encounter with Eastern European Jews. But in Lodz, there happens something very important, and that is that because of Rumkowski and the way he organizes the ghetto, it becomes an example. And in the wake of the success of the Lodz ghetto during its first weeks, German officials from other places are coming to Lodz to watch this place, this idea. Right? And it's copied to other places. Also from Warsaw, they're coming to Lodz. Right? So it starts to spread. Right? And that's very important for us to understand the Lodz ghetto. That is the interaction between Bibo, the German commander of the Jewish community in Lodz, and the effective way that Rumkowski ran the Lodz ghetto made the ghetto as a phenomenon an example to be copied to other places. Right? So the success of the Lodz ghetto becomes the reason that it is copied over and over, all right? And then at the beginning of 1941, we see it already spread to more and more places. But as we can see, it is a reaction. It is a reaction to the encounter with the East European Jew, and it is not part of an overall program as Hilbert conceived it. And therefore, in many places, we don't have ghettos until the very end. Right? And the role of the ghetto also changes all the time. Right? So in the beginning, it is a kind of reaction. Then when it becomes successful, it becomes a source for forced labor also. And then it becomes part and parcel of the anti-Jewish means at hand for commanders. So when they enter the Soviet Union in 1941, it becomes also part of the arsenal of means to deal with the Jewish population. But we have to look at what happens in the Soviet Union. That the murderers start before the establishment of ghettos. Right? So it is not, as Michael Alberti and others has said, well, the ghetto is a stage and a means leading toward a final solution. In many places, such as in Vilna and so on, there is a first wave of killings, and then the ghetto is established, keeping those people who will be used for forced labor, for instance. Right? And there are places where, in the area of the Soviet Union, where the ghetto is established some 9th or 10th month after the Jewish Council was established. Right? And there are orders, and maybe we'll move. We have to finish now. This is, by the way, in the signs put in Warsaw in the summer of 1940. That is 3 months, 3-4 months before the closing of the ghetto. That it is a dangerous area of epidemics. And maybe this is the Jewish street in Amsterdam, where I don't have the time here to deal with it, but the idea was raised in Amsterdam because of a kind of interpretation as the Amsterdam Jewish community with its 80,000 Jews is a kind of an Eastern European model, so we should do it, but there is no ghetto in Amsterdam at the end. Let's go on. Please. Yeah. General Karl von Rockers, who is the commander of the Rear Army North, writes in August 28, 1941, ghettos should be installed in places where the Jews are a large portion of the population, especially in the cities when their establishment is needed, or at least when it serves the goals. But, several days later, in no situation is the establishment of ghettos to be seen as urgent. Right? And later on, in Lemberg, Lvov, the commander in October 1941 says, it is unthinkable that in Lemberg the Jews should be treated differently than in Krakow and Warsaw. Right? So if they have a ghetto, we should also have a ghetto. We are copying it, right? We're using it. Because it's part of the anti-Jewish measures which we know about. But it is not something which leads, as Hilberg saw it, as a step towards the final solution. Therefore, we don't find it in Germany. We don't find it in Western Europe. We don't find it in Southern Europe, except for one place. Salonika, where the short-term concentration of Jews in the Baron Hirsch area is called a ghetto. Right? And we have the exceptional, the very interesting case of Theresienstadt, which I cannot relate to now. But the term ghetto, therefore, its meaning is changing all the time. All right? And it is not part and parcel of planned anti-Jewish policies. It is not something which leads to the final solution. But it is a major component of anti-Jewish policies in Eastern Europe as a reaction to the Eastern European Jew. Maybe that's all. I cannot go now too much into the Soviet Union, but to the conclusion, there is it's not bureaucratic planning or internal bureaucratic logic which caused the emergence of the first Nazi ghettos, but deeply internalized anti-Semitic fears the Ostjuden, the Eastern European Jew. And that is a cultural, has a cultural history going back to the 19th century. The Ostjuden and German Jews also a little bit contributed to this view of the Ostjuden, Eastern European Jew, as being a second-class Jew, right? And it's very, no, let's go on to the next one. I don't want to read it. And it's more important that there was no typical ghetto. In educational materials and also in scholarly research, Warsaw is seen as the typical ghetto, right? But there is no typical ghetto. There are all kinds of ghettos. And ghettos were existed for several years, and there were ghettos that existed for several months or for several weeks. And the ghettos, and they were called ghettos, in Hungary in 1944, were actually transition stations on the way to Auschwitz. So the term ghetto is used, but in an entirely different way than in Warsaw in 1940. Or in Piotrków Trybunalski in September 1939. So it is a fluctuating term. There is no one ghetto. Right? Ghetto and Judenrat are not Siamese twins. It's very important. The Judenrat, and that's something which I'm writing also about already for many years, but the Jewish Council phenomenon is a bureaucratic measure which evolves already in the 1930s and is implemented in a systematic way all over Europe and even North Africa. Right? And Irit is sitting here. In Tunisia, there are beginnings of a Jewish council in a way that was implemented in all over Europe. Right? Ghettos we only find in Eastern Europe. It has to do with the image of the Eastern European Jew and the fear of the Germans for the Eastern European Jew. Right? But it is a term which is historically taken over and not invented. It's not part of the Nazi language as such. Right? It is a historical term which is transformed during the Nazi period and shows us how important also traditional anti-Semitism is in understanding Jewish life during this period. We have Nazi anti-Semitism, but we have also a long-term old types of anti-Semitism which play a role during the Nazi period. And therefore, ending this presentation, we have to see that ghettos are a very important part of Eastern European Jewish life during this period, right? But they were not a part of the process, of the more planned process leading to the final solution. It was there, but but the decisions about the final solution are taken entirely separately from the ghetto phenomenon. The ghetto phenomenon did not interest Hitler at all. There is only one occasion where it is mentioned in front of him, but he didn't care about it. And we can see also that the final solution was implemented all over Europe, and with the intentions also beyond Europe, without needing ghettos. It could be done without ghettos. It was done without ghettos. Ghettos are therefore a very important feature of the period of the Holocaust, but they are a radical outcome of traditional anti-Semitism and not something which is part of the process which led to the final solution. Thank you very much.